listening to Make It, a podcast by Bonsai Creative that helps creatives in film get where they're going faster by sharing the advice, knowledge, and insights of professional creatives across the film industry. I'm your host, Chris Barkley.
Hello, America. My name is Michael McCray, and I am the founder and co-organizer for the Whistleblower Summit and Film Festival. It's the largest conference and festival for whistleblowers on Capitol Hill in the country. You may know me from either the Whistleblower Summit, but then also I was the national spokesperson for the ACORN 8, which was a group of whistleblowers who blew the whistle on ACORN, and it ultimately involved in the co-creation of the Whistleblower Summit. And one of the projects that I'm working on now, first, we are continuously trying to expand the Whistleblower Summit, encourage new filmmakers. And then we're also working on a passion project that deals with essentially a documentary about whistleblowers told from the perspective of whistleblowers.
Michael McCray, welcome to the Make It podcast.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And to give this audience a deeper sense of who you are, I'm going to read a little bit from a bio. Of course, this is the internet and things can be wrong, as I always say. So if there's anything that needs correcting, feel free to jump in and correct me. Michael McCray co-founded the International Association of Whistleblowers and is the general counsel for the Federally Employed Women Legal Education Fund, which champions equal employment opportunity. He is an active member of the No Fear Coalition, which promotes and supports the passage of the Notification and Federal Employee Anti-Discrimination and Retaliation Act of 2002, which was the first civil rights law of the 21st century. McCray is also the chief organizer for the Whistleblower Summit for Civil and Human Rights, an annual conference that takes place on Capitol Hill. Michael is a 2007 recipient of the No Fear Award in Washington, D.C. In 2008, Michael received statewide recognition for outstanding work in peace and social justice when he was recognized by the OMNI Center for Peace, Justice, and Ecology as an Arkansas Peace and Justice Hero in Fayetteville, Arkansas. And Michael, we are going to jump around quite a bit in this conversation, as we tend to do on the Make It podcast. And having spent sort of the last week in the world of Michael McCray and enjoying every bit of it, I'd love to start with the story behind "You are not to reason why, you are to do or die."
That quote that you're talking about was my first experience foray into whistleblowing. Again, I'm from Pine Bluff, Arkansas, small town in central Arkansas, actually in the Arkansas, Mississippi River Delta. My hometown had the dubious distinction of being ranked the worst place to live in America 2 years in a row. We went back to back. And from there, I grew to love kind of my community and wanted to do things to improve my community. It just so happened that, and I say this all the time, that on my way to Wall Street, my governor ran for president and I got to work at the White House. And what wound up happening is when Governor Clinton won the presidency, I wound up going to Washington and working for the federal government on a White House initiative that was designed to redevelop urban and rural communities. It was called the Federal Empowerment Zones Program, and it was the largest community development, community aid package since Lyndon Johnson's and the Great Society programs. So I literally had found a way to help to redevelop communities like my own. And I had the distinction of getting to travel all across the country and visit the worst places to live in America because those were the communities that needed help. But I was really ecstatic. It was a great experience. Back then, I was working on a team that kind of reported to the White House. The way the program was structured was it was a White House initiative, but it was administered by HUD, USDA, and HHS. HHS had the Title 20 funding. HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, was in charge of the urban empowerment zones, and USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, was over the rural zones. And so we kind of worked together. And if you recall when Vice President Al Gore invented the internet, well, I was on the team that worked with it. And so what we were doing was pioneering new technologies for community development. And so it was a really cool experience up to a certain point. That point was I was in charge. I was at USDA, and my background is finance. I was going to Georgetown Law School at night while I was working for the federal government in the daytime, and I was doing a concurrent JD MBA. So they utilized my skills in terms of the grant application process, and I had the distinction of essentially guarding the grants. I was a part of the team I set up the review process, and I was over grant security. Long story short, we wound up in a situation where prior to the final award of a grant, because we had the reviewers and the review teams reviewed it, scored it. There was 2 rounds of reviews. So we had this very qualitative process, and we quantified the scores, and we wound up sending them to the Secretary of Agriculture's office, supposedly for a final review. Ultimately, what wound up happening is Secretary Mike Espy put his thumb on the scale, and there was an award that went to an award of $40 million that went to a nonprofit that was in the congressional district that he had just vacated. He was a former congressman from Mississippi. He was tapped to be the Secretary of Agriculture by the Clinton administration. His brother, Henry Espy, was running for his vacated seat. And there was this grant opportunity that essentially got steered to that district. Now, when I talk about Mike Espy, when people remember Mike Espy, we think of, he got his slapped on the wrist. He had taken some football tickets and attended, I think like an Ole Miss football game or something that was relatively minor was what we know about him. Is what the public knows about him, and that he was forced to resign. What the public doesn't know about it was what I just told you, that there was $40 million steered to a nonprofit that was not grant worthy. And that's how I became a whistleblower. The quote that you just mentioned was when I saw the announcements, I immediately went to my supervisor. And I was, I guess really kind of young and naive. To me, it seemed simple. It didn't seem like it was such a great idea to give $40 million to a nonprofit. There's really a new nonprofit that essentially didn't have a checking account. So they didn't have all the financial controls. And it was literally one of the worst, if not the worst, grant application that we'd received. But, back then, and this was, I guess now we don't really talk about congressional earmarks, but during the 90s, that was part of the way that people stayed in line was you got the what we call the horse trading in politics. Congressional representatives could steer funding to their districts. Now, in my opinion, one of the biggest sin that Mike Espy had was that the things that you're allowed to do as a congressman back then, accepting a ticket to the Ole Miss game, if you're a congressional representative, doesn't violate the rules. Earmarking funding for your district, if you're a congressional representative, does not violate the rules. Once you join the administration, though, once you join the executive branch, these things are prohibited. So I really think that Mike Espy kind of got caught up in you thinking in the old ways and the ethics of his old position, and not really appreciating his new position. So that, in a nutshell, that's kind of my position about Michael Espy. But to make a long story short, I go to my supervisor, and he tells me, he kind of quotes the charge of the light brigade. Mine is not the reason why, mine is but to do or die. And at the time, we're dealing with whistleblowers now, and sometimes we talk about conspiracy theories. But if you recall, at the time, there were some mysterious things that were happening in and around the Clinton administration. The Vince Foster suicide, there was the issue with Iran-Contra, and there was a strange death in Mena, Arkansas. And so at the time, I didn't know whether to laugh or to be afraid, or if that was literally a threat. And, I kind of write about it, and I've talked about it. I've actually written about that in blogs, and I'm not sure if I wrote about that in my book. But that's what that refers to. That's how I became a federal whistleblower. And that kind of started this journey that will eventually take us into the discussion about the film festival and some of the subsequent events. But I became a whistleblower back in the Clinton administration when I reported $40 million worth of waste, fraud, and abuse at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And that changed my life forever.
Yeah, I remember watching a documentary in the early 90s called, I want to say it was called The Clinton Files, or The Clinton 12 or something like it. It was an indie doc, and it basically listed off all the people who were dead and their story in connection to the Clintons in Arkansas. So this was this was one of those kind of, I think it was written off at the time as like, okay, here's the hit piece from the opposition to try to damage his presidential hopes. Right. You could imagine that, it felt very similar to, the stories that came out about Obama before he got elected. Like right. I kept seeing these people get online and say, oh, well, Obama's got HIV, or,
right.
Michelle is actually a man, and
right.
all these things that have, very questionable, right? Like, okay, right. We see that you're just trying to keep Obama from getting elected. That's what I think this documentary got written off as. But but the difference being that these people were real, in the sense that you could go and research them and document them and go to the library and figure out what really happened and read clippings. And if you took the time to do that, it got very scary indeed. So
yeah, well, that was kind of the backstory. And I hadn't seen the documentary, but when you're from Arkansas, and again, part of how I got there was, Governor Clinton has been there a number of years, and you kind of hear these stories, and it just that one kind of got to me in the moment. I was like, wait a minute. Right. So yeah, that was a very that was a very chilling experience for me.
Explain the concept of the Fifth Estate.
Okay. Well, I think the best way to do that is, in general, Chris, the term whistleblower, we use it now, but really it began being used heavily roughly in the 1970s, post-Watergate, and then also with Ralph Nader and the consumer, the car auto manufacturing, the kind of Consumer Reports. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's when the term that we use today, in the context that we use it today, is roughly something that came about in the early 70s. The actual first whistleblower law was passed by the Continental Congress in 1778 on July 30th. That date is important because now we celebrate National Whistleblower Appreciation Day on that day, and we actually anchor our Whistleblower Summit and Film Festival the week of that day. Why was this important to the Continental Congress? There's a story that I will always mangle, but essentially the first whistleblowers were a group of sailors, and we give an award in their honor. It's called the Shaw Marvin Award. But essentially there were a group of sailors that had a very bad captain, and they wound up reporting his malfeasance to Congress. They got locked up and wrote letters to Congress. And essentially the way that Congress responded was that they passed a law that said that it's the duty of every American citizen to report to Congress wrongdoing by the government at the first instance. And so essentially whistleblowing is actually tied to the First Amendment. When you think about it, the First Amendment protects our ability. People say that, think of it as the public has a right to know, but really it's publishers have a right to publish. But the concept is you have to have these things to constrain the government, or else we'll evolve into tyranny, which is interesting as to what's going on right now.
Right.
And so in that we have, of course, when we talk about the states, the fourth estate, the first three estates being the government, the executive, and the courts. The fourth estate is commonly recognized as being the media, the press. And I say that the whistleblowers are the fifth estate, because really you can't have a free press without news sources, and you can't have congressional oversight without government informants. So these are the things, whistleblowers are the things that allow the other estates to operate. And so that's why I say that whistleblowers are the fifth estate.
Do you know the origin of the term whistleblower?
That is a great question. I have heard that it was kind of coined in the vernacular that we use now by Ralph Nader. If you actually look up the word, there was a period of time when they would refer to just like whistleblowing is, literally like referees and stuff. Mm-hmm. But the context that we utilize it now, and I think maybe the earliest one was probably in the 1960s. There was a blip, but if you actually research the term, you'll see that there's this geometric growth from the 70s. But I can't tell you exactly what the origin story is for that term.
I'm always fascinated by the connection between what we understand today and the sort of context in which we live and constructs in which we live today, and that connection back in history that started these things. And I don't know if people care anymore. We had a conversation before this for this podcast conversation where we talked about sort of the degradation of sort of society's ability to critically think and even care about why things are the way they are. But I've always been fascinated by it. I actually read last night, just doing some reading, and some people go to the club on Saturday night. I stay home and read.
There's a pandemic, man. You're a smart guy.
Right. And that was fun for me. And I just found out the meaning of cracker, like why that is I think it's probably used as a slur today, even though its origins were quite the opposite. The term cracker comes from the Florida and Georgia crackers, or what's called a cracker cowboy. And those were these sort of lawless, braggadocious cowboys from Florida and Georgia. And they also, of course, owned slaves and things like that. And so it had this dual meaning, right? So
interesting. I thought that was the crack of the whip.
Exactly. So that's exactly right. So there's a dual meaning. So the word crack comes from Britain, to mean someone who cracks jokes and brags on themselves a lot. And it's just like sort of verbose and all that stuff. But Black folks the Black community came to take it as the sound of the crack of the whip, both on them and on the cattle that they were gathering and herding in the wild, because they would try to gather wild cattle that didn't belong to anybody, and so they were called. And that's really the term of cowboys came from. So it's really fascinating to connect that to the way that we use it today, and that dual meaning. So anyway, that was an aside, but I thought I would share it because it's kind of
it's a good one. And again, bringing it back to kind of what we're just talking about, the common usage of the term whistleblower, and also the perception of who whistleblowers are. Today came from the 70s, and really came from Daniel Ellsberg and Ralph Nader.
Yes.
And interestingly enough, when we segue back to the summit and the film festival, this year we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the publishing of the Pentagon Papers. And that was the theme for the summit this year. And we actually got Daniel Ellsberg to be the keynote speaker.
Wow. Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, we should talk about where people can see that if it's possible sometime in this conversation. You mentioned earlier that your governor got elected president. How did your family become associated with the Clintons?
Oh, wow. Interesting. My mother worked for the local university of Arkansas, Pine Bluff. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of, Chris, man, it's really kind of funny you asked me that. And because, of course, she's mom to me. But at the time, she was dean of the agriculture department. And my mother was was very much renowned at USDA for the research and the work. You actually worked in fisheries. And so the local university, UAPB, had become like what they call a center of excellence. And interestingly enough, my family, her sister, my auntie, Linda Willis, was simultaneously the dean of agriculture for Prairie View A&M. And so they were the only sister team pair that were deans of ag at the same time. I say all of this is that, so in terms of working with the local university, I think I had a cousin that wound up going to Girls State, where she met the governor. I really can't place a finger on the exact time, but because Governor Clinton had sincerely done outreach in the African-American community, had African-American advisors that were basically enmeshed in the Black community. I can't really point a finger to it, but between knowing the Clintons, or more so knowing friends of the Clintons, it feels like it had been all my life, or at least all since high school or whatnot, possibly junior high. So my family had a connection to Clinton world if I didn't know him directly. It's kind of how I grew up, and that was part of when the team went to Washington, how I got. And then again, I wasn't. I was a low man on the totem pole. They didn't bring me in as, deputy administrator. I was a guy that had been I actually, interestingly enough, as we talk about President Obama, I've been a student organizer because I was in law school then. And I wound up, and now that I think about it, people didn't know that the Empowerment Zone program was going to work. And so a lot of times what you'll see in federal government, when they have details, a lot of times some of the agencies will release some of their more problematic employees, and it almost became like an island of misfit toys. But you had this cadre of people that probably weren't the most well-liked in all of their different departments, all working together to roll out this very important economic development initiative. And it just so happened that, that was when the internet was booming. What we were doing back then, we were doing virtual reality tours of the White House. It's 1995, kind of stuff that we're just talking about today. Not quite with the deep fakes, but a lot of that technology stuff and the GIS mapping. As a matter of fact, it was interesting because it was competitive between the HUD and USDA as to who had the best technology. And for a period, because everybody always assumes HUD because everybody thinks of USDA as farmers, subsistence farming. But actually, we have better technology over at USDA, and I was on the team that was helping to deploy and teach it. So I got to go all around the country, then setting up websites, web pages, using new technology for community development and community empowerment. So it was very interesting times.
Yeah, it reminds me of a couple of things, just the birth of the internet and how to leverage it. Heard this story about George W. Bush having this sort of interactive internet-based simulation that people could sort of, I guess, go to the White House and do, or go to the Capitol and be a part of, and it's immersive and engaging, and it basically puts all this counterfactual in front of this audience and says, okay, now would you invade Iraq? Would you would you do what would you do after the towers were hit and all this stuff? And you have to decide. And if you make a decision that was different than George W. Bush made, the simulation says that's the wrong decision.
Well, Chris, I was just about to co-sign with you, because at that time they were doing also stuff with the budget. And they were talking about when people think that we have all these millions and billions of dollars to spend, that's discretionary. And really, there's, relatively speaking, there's only a small amount, a small sliver, because between the entitlement programs and the military, you eat up all these trillions of dollars. So I do recall that interactive capability. I don't quite recall the agreeing with George Bush, but I'll take you on your word.
And look, I could be wrong. Somebody, please, if you've had that experience and you know better, email us and hit us up on social media and get me straight on that. But it also reminds me of something Dick Gregory used to say, which is that Black people turned Bill Clinton into this sort of ultra Black character, and they turned Obama into somebody that wasn't Black, and it was like, in his mind, one of the biggest mistakes the Black community could make. And it is kind of fascinating that.
Oh, we can do a whole nother show on that one.
Yeah. We sort of uplifted really Bill Clinton.
Huh?
Exactly. I was like, we sort of uplifted Bill Clinton and made him a quote unquote, brother. And then we said, oh no, Obama's not Black enough.
There are actually two shows there, Chris.
That's right. Okay, so we definitely have to do a round two. You mentioned being part of the ACORN 8, and reading about this story is absolutely fascinating to me, because your whistleblowing efforts dismantled the organization, essentially, that had been around for a long time. And I guess what jumped out to me is this curiosity around how they started. In your estimation, did ACORN start with a benevolent purpose? Do most organizations like this start with a benevolent purpose, and then sort of some human come in and say, ooh, I can take advantage of this, and please share the acronym if you'd like.
Okay.
For ACORN.
Okay. Well, Chris, you are a great interviewer, man.
Thank you.
Okay. The acronym for ACORN is the Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now, ACORN. It originally was Arkansas Community Organizations for Reform Now, and most people don't know that it was actually founded in Little Rock. It is essentially an offshoot of an organization called the National Welfare Rights Organization that was started by, and I don't want to, this is a brother, that was started by, he had a PhD in chemistry. I think it's George Wiley. I'll double check that for you. And the gentleman who is now accredited with creating ACORN was a lieutenant for the National Welfare Rights Organization. His name was Wade Rathke. And the Welfare Rights Organization was a direct action organization. They're very militant, used the same types of tactics that ACORN did. But somewhere along the line, they decided that it was better to try to organize the working class than necessarily just people on welfare. And so Wiley sent Rathke to Arkansas, where he started this project that has become ACORN. And the idea was essentially to organize a broader segment of the community, the working class, not just the welfare rights people. In my mind, and it's very interesting because Wiley was a person that I believe would have been targeted by COINTELPRO. He winds up disappearing in the 70s. And I kind of just, I always kind of watch the different information that's released about COINTELPRO, but it was that type of organization that would have been on the radar of the FBI because of some of the work and the tactics that they were doing. And so essentially, the Welfare Rights Organization essentially dissipates after the disappearance of Wiley, and ACORN becomes stronger. And you're actually, what you just said, man, is the opening quote to my next book. If I jump back into what am I working on now.
Oh, awesome.
I actually do want to tell more in depth the story of ACORN. A couple years ago, I happened to go to the Hot Springs Documentary Film Festival, and I watched this film called ACORN and the Firestorm. Mm-hmm. And it was a film by Ruben Atlas that essentially talks about how wonderful ACORN was and how dastardly Andrew Breitbart, Hannah Giles, James O'Keefe, the fake pimp and pro that took down ACORN. And it was interesting to me, Chris, because they tell it from a way that they talk about the manipulated videos, that they were fakes, or deep fakes, or just regular fakes, and how the I don't want to say the genesis, but the conclusion that one draws after watching this documentary was that ACORN was wonderful, Hannah Giles and Andrew Breitbart were bad, and they took down this wonderful organization. And there's no mention of the ACORN 8. So during the question and answer period, I asked the guy, the filmmaker wasn't there, but his father, John Atlas, was a producer, and he also is a journalist, and he had actually interviewed the ACORN 8. And the interesting thing about him was he's kind of I guess we call him a progressive, but when the people that were talking about ACORN, that were really going after ACORN, most of them were from the far right. They were conservative activists. The ACORN 8 were actually attacking ACORN from the left, saying that it wasn't empowering people, that it was using people. We were essentially useful idiots, and that our goal really wasn't to destroy ACORN. It was to reform ACORN. We were trying to save ACORN from itself. Things kind of got out of hand, but that was what our goal was. So we were true believers fighting for ACORN, fighting for the rights of low and middle and working class people. Long story short, I wound up asking this question about, well, why did he leave out why did he omit actual ACORN whistleblowers from his documentary? And of course, he kind of poo-pooed it. But it's essentially, he didn't include us because we didn't fit his narrative. And for me, the irony of all of that is he essentially did the same thing that Breitbart did and James O'Keefe. They invented video that basically they told a lie, I guess, of commission by creating this false perception about ACORN. The Atlas and his son, they tell a lie of omission by failing to talk about the whistleblowers and the actual people that were trying to form the organization. So it was the juxtaposition of two people arguing about media manipulation, using manipulated media, which kind of blew me away. But anyway, during the conversation, we found out that there were a lot of people who want to know the story of the ACORN 8. And that's actually a segue into a project that I'm working on. I'm really trying to finish up a book about what really happened and how ACORN really fell as a book, and then possibly some type of other media, whether it's a documentary or perhaps a feature film.
That's an incredible background and story, and it highlights one of the things I'm really concerned about now. And I do have a journalism background. I double majored in journalism and marketing at Middle Tennessee State University, and the thing that's happening now is corporate journalism, and it is so dangerous to that fourth estate, especially in how it can either manipulate or silence or not utilize the fifth estate. And what I mean by corporate journalism is now every journalist is basically an employee of a giant corporate entity. And they're just employees. They're typically the people on the bottom of the totem pole, the lowest paid employees as well in general. And these corporations are now doing, they have quarter by quarter numbers they need to hit based on the market and other factors. And they just look at data and say, well, what got us the most retweets? What got us the most clicks? Okay, let's run more stories like that. And that ends up being the journalism that we get instead of the sort of independent journalism that we need to have a strong fourth estate.
Yeah. I think you can go back to the Clinton bashing on that one. Or whatever, whenever the Telecommunications Act that essentially allowed more corporate control, more corporate ownership of local media companies, the consolidation of the press is, I blame that for that dynamic. The argument against it is as the internet became more widely used, that there theoretically were more voices. So therefore, there were more opportunities, even if they weren't from your local newspaper. Mm-hmm. But I think we can see now that one, the danger of using news as a profit center as opposed to a public service is devastating. And then the other part is the dumbing down of the population. One, if you don't read your local stories, people already had a problem with media literacy in general. Mm-hmm. When you take away the local stories, it winds up being replaced by your Facebook feed. And then if you don't have a police or a check on Facebook between the algorithms and these promotions for excitement and clickbait, you're dumbing down society and then you're feeding them garbage. And we wind up in the situation where we are right now with our democracy actually being in jeopardy.
Yeah, anyone who's listening that wants to play a fun game and maybe potentially terrifying game, go on Twitter and then type in something about Taiwan or Hong Kong or the Uyghurs and then put hashtag China at the end of it. And within 6 hours, you will be bombarded by Chinese bots just fighting you, ready to discredit you, take you down. And it's fascinating how some of this stuff works.
That's scary.
Yes.
It's scary to me.
Yeah, likewise. Frank Serpico, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, said Serpico. Thank you. Frank Serpico. He said the most expensive gift you can bestow on humanity is to be a lamplighter whistleblower. You pay for it the rest of your life. Why
Chris,
do we
it's interesting. He doesn't
dislike whistleblowers?
Wait, Michael. I'm sorry, say it again.
I said, why do we dislike whistleblowers?
Wow. 2 points. One, Frank Serpico, that is the Serpico, the guy that the film's about, that Al Pacino played.
Yep.
It's interesting that Serpico actually came to one of the whistleblower conferences, had a chance to meet him. And it's funny to me because Serpico does not like the term whistleblower. He feels it's a negative moniker. He prefers lamplighter. Mm. So if you actually have him quoted as actually using the term whistleblower, you got a scoop there because he usually doesn't do that. For whatever reason, we've developed this culture where, one of the reasons that people don't like whistleblowers is that we've allowed the definition to essentially become a pejorative. So if you look in this, Chris, let me do this. Let me connect kind of my whistleblowing to the summit, because that's kind of how you also got you get the backstory to ACORN, and then Perfect. Also what we're trying to do at the summit to reclaim whistleblowing.
Perfect.
So essentially, after I blew the whistle during the Clinton administration, it essentially changed my life forever. And to make a long story short, what you were hitting on is how devastating it is your career, your family standing. It's an incredible journey. I tell people that rock bottom was the firm foundation that I rebuilt my life on. And the way that I did it was two things happened to me. One, my father gave me a book one Christmas that was Rick Warren's A Purpose-Driven Life. And then two, I attended a whistleblower conference in 2007. The conference was put on by a coalition of advocacy groups called the Make It Safe Coalition. Back then it was called Whistleblowers Week in Washington. And for me, I found my tribe. I found a home. I found a place where people actually understood what I was going through. And it was very cathartic. It may have literally saved my life. It definitely saved my sanity. I was working with the No Fear Coalition, which is something that you mentioned. And we, during that week, it was a full week, and there was a No Fear Day where we were celebrating the passage of the No Fear Act. That's kind of how I got involved in the whistleblowing community. So now I had people that actually understood what I was suffering through. One of the things that happened as a result of that, it was so life affirming for me. I actually I decided that I wanted to continue to keep it going. That's kind of how I got into hosting or co-hosting this event. But that's something that whistleblowing, it wasn't necessarily the very first whistleblower conference. There was another group called Integrity International that had a whistleblower event. I think Ralph Nader's group had done one earlier, but whistleblowers did not continuously meet prior to 2007. And we've kind of kept it going since then. We wound up with so I get immersed into the whistleblower community. I become an advocate. We wound up creating the International Association of Whistleblowers. The reason we kind of did that was early on, different organizations would host the conference, and the conference took on the flavor of the organization that hosted it. So if you were a policy group, you spent a lot of time on the Hill doing legislative advocacy, having lobby days. We wanted to start to create an entity that kind of reflected, a conference for whistleblowers by whistleblowers. And we wound up creating the International Association of Whistleblowers to do that. And in the process, we continued to do the policy work, but then we also started to have like the social events. We would just get together, and really we had one night was movie night with the whistleblowers, where we get together and watch all the President's Men, Aaron Brockovich, Serpico. There was a fun way to kind of, the whistleblowing, the topic itself is so heavy. We just needed a way to kick back and kind of socialize. And then we were also doing whistleblower book signings. Ultimately, what started to happen then was people started to gravitate towards the social aspects. And so then we thought that, hey, well, here's an opportunity for us to, hang on, let me put a pin there. Once I became involved in the whistleblower community, other whistleblowers would approach me for help. And that's how I kind of got involved with ACORN and the ACORN 8. Marcel Reed was one of the whistleblowers at ACORN. And I had been, after I left federal government, I actually went down to Atlanta and was working for a hotel development, African-American hotel development company. And we purchased a boutique hotel on Peachtree Street. Long story short, ultimately we became a early victim of commercial mortgage fraud. And we went to ACORN for help. And so I wound up becoming a board member of ACORN, and I was working with Marcel Reed because we were on the national board together. Essentially, there was an embezzlement that was discovered. Marcel becomes essentially a whistleblower. She comes to me for help because she knew that I had been a whistleblower in the federal government. She knew that I worked with whistleblowers, and I was connected to that space. And so I was able to kind of guide the ACORN 8. I was actually the national spokesperson for the ACORN 8 as we kind of navigated that battle. So that was my connection to her. We ultimately together had decided that we wanted to start to do the conference to continue the whistleblower, what we now call the Whistleblower Summit. Back then, when the International Association of Whistleblowers had it, it was the Whistleblower Assembly. But one of the interesting things that we noted there was whistleblowing was always kept in the perspective of public health and safety. And what makes a difference about that is that there are a lot of whistleblowers that don't see civil rights or EEO activity as whistleblowing. They think that to be a whistleblower, you have to work with other people. You have to, let's take Rodney King. Mm-hmm. There are people that will say that the videographer, the person who captured the beatings on film, was the whistleblower, but Rodney King wasn't, because essentially Rodney King would have been blowing the whistle on something that affected him directly. What our position is that whistleblowing we started to view whistleblowing through this prism of civil and human rights. And so Marcel and I came up with, we're going to create the Whistleblower Summit for Civil and Human Rights that would broaden the audience and the attention and just create a broader perspective on whistleblowing that was more inclusive and wouldn't just be the ivory tower with, generally speaking, older white men. Mm-hmm. And so that was one of the innovations that we made. And then during the process of that, as we started to continue with the movie night, filmmakers started wanting to come screen their films. Well, no, first we had the movie nights, and then we decided, well, let's do something more than be social. Let's curate. Let's go find other important films, documentary filmmakers that have films that we think are important that aren't being recognized. And so we decided to try to use our platform to spotlight and highlight other important films and other journalists. And it really worked out very well, Chris. And then what wound up happening is filmmakers started to come to us and say they wanted to screen at the summit.
Right.
And so, long story short, the Whistleblower Summit for Civil and Human Rights evolves into the Whistleblower Summit and Film Festival, because we started to capture we captured the policy aspects and advocacy aspects of whistleblowing, but then we also wanted to talk about whistleblowing as it relates to popular culture and pop culture, and that we started to become more successful with it. And ultimately, we wound up building an award-winning festival. I think we won a Best Festival Award in 2019 from Fest Forums. So that's kind of how the whole Whistleblower Summit, the film festival, was created, and kind of the work that we do.
Yeah, and Marcel Reed is still a partner of yours in this, correct?
Absolutely. Yeah, we do this together.
So such a big contributor, a big part of your success with this. And the purpose-driven life you mentioned, and we'll link out to that book in the show notes, has been so influential in everyone's life. And I know that your family had been victims of, struck by suicide, and you were at that place as well. And this book turned it around for you because, again, going back to the Serpico line, you pay for whistleblowing for the rest of your life, and it can really, like you said, take you down to rock bottom in a way that very few people, actually experience. You mentioned the filmmakers coming to you. That doesn't surprise me at all, because filmmakers are hungry for stories that give them a strong why. Like, oh, now I'm telling a story that is relatable to me and everyone else in the zeitgeist. It has prescience. It's important to tell right now, and it has urgency to it. This is legacy building. It's not just storytelling on its own. I guess I'm curious to know from you, having run this festival, do you know of any retaliation made against independent filmmakers who make whistleblower documentaries and movies?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting that, we'll find that, the whistleblowers themselves face retaliation, and sometimes the filmmakers, the journalists, take on retaliation as well, the reporters. It can be everybody in the food chain. As a matter of fact, we a number of films that have received awards at the festival were about just that. The journalists that were covering stories. Some of these tended to be, I think, more international. I can't remember the specific films offhand, but no, that happens as well. One of the, as a matter of fact, interestingly enough, Cheryl Atkinson, who does Full Measure now, and it's her audience is very much right now. We honored her with a Pillar Award when she blew the whistle on CBS earlier in her career. So yeah, no, we know that happens as well. And then, again, when you start to talk about the corporate ownership of media, I think that opens the door to more retaliation, because there is no longer just the pure journalism or public service motive for journalists now. You like you just said, you still have to talk to the bean counters. And if there's something that goes against the profit revenue generation, you would be susceptible to the same types of retaliation and backlash that other whistleblowers are. I don't think there may be as much of a stigma possibly for journalists, because one may be because you guys already start off with a platform. It's harder if you're established. It's kind of harder to totally erase you. But with whistleblowers, with individual whistleblowers, they literally can wipe you from memory.
Yeah, you mentioned Rodney King earlier, and I might be getting some of the details wrong, but it's my understanding that the person who shot the video died very shortly after the incident. And because he didn't have a name, because he wasn't the victim, almost to no fanfare. And it just went by, and it was apparently a car accident, but it was like straight out of like Basic Instinct or some film noir where like he has brake failure and careens over the side of a road. Yeah, it's very suspicious that how he died. And
are you familiar with the name Gary Webb?
I'm not.
Gary Webb was the reporter who reported on Iran-Contra, broke the story, with Ollie North and all of that. Basically, he broke the story about Iran-Contra. And he was found to have committed suicide by shooting himself in the face twice.
I mean, it's not funny, but the absurdity of it.
Yeah, right. Double tap to the face, not the temple. He didn't eat a gun. He was shot in the face twice, and they ruled it a suicide.
Right, and these are the things, and you look at Khashoggi and the way he was brutally murdered. And the thing about Khashoggi that people don't know is that he was somebody, meaning his family was incredibly wealthy and incredibly well intertwined with royalty in multiple countries. So, for example, Khashoggi's cousin, I believe, or I want to say cousin or maybe uncle, was one of the people that, or was the guy that was dating Princess Diana at the time that she died.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So Khashoggi's not just a journalist. He was somebody, and they did him like that. And this is what makes people feel
you just answered
hopeless,
the question for me, Chris, because I always wondered, why would you feel safe going to another embassy for whatever documents that you needed for to get married? It makes more sense to me if he was from a family of influence, and he may have thought that would protect him somehow. Yeah. So I was like, man, that's the craziest, you know what I'm saying? That's the craziest thing in the world.
Yep. It's what I tell people all the time. I say, if you're reading a news story, the first question you have to ask is, why were you given this story? Why did they write this? And in 2021 with the internet, because of algorithms, you have to ask, why was this story sent to me? Why was it put in front of me? What is it I'm doing on the internet that makes the algorithms know or believe that I would be interested in this kind of story? And then once you ask that question, you can start to critically think about how you might be getting manipulated one way or the other. But that first question is evergreen, which is, of all the people murdered in the world, why are they covering Khashoggi so heavily? And the reason why is because he was somebody. And he had connections in the UK, Britain, Egypt, US. And so this was an important figure across the world of journalism and international politics. For sure. The challenges for independent filmmakers to create whistleblower films. What are they saying to you? Like, what is is it getting information? I mean, are they using encrypted email like GPG, or like what are the challenges these independent filmmakers are having to overcome to just create the movie that you've heard on the ground?
Yeah. Well, Chris, I haven't really heard, we're not quite there yet. We're kind of creating this channel and this platform that connects whistleblowers to filmmakers. And so we're kind of making inroads there. And what we try to tell people is we tell journalists, the reason you should come to the Whistleblower Summit is so that you can find out, you can hear the news, you can learn the news before it's news. And what we tell filmmakers is this: there is a reservoir. While no matter how bad people treat whistleblowers or how poorly whistleblowers are thought of, everybody loves whistleblower stories. And so we're a place where
that's fascinating. It's true, though. It's so true.
Yeah. No, so we're a repository of stories. And here's the other thing, Chris. People don't know the stats, but by and large, you have a better chance to commit suicide than you have of winning your whistleblower case. About 5% of whistleblowers when they actually win their cases. About 10% of whistleblowers commit suicide. So the odds are really stacked against you, even though the ones that you're going to hear about are the people who won and got the huge recovery and possibly won a reward for their whistleblowing. But by and large, it's a very dangerous road to go through. And the deck is, well, what most whistleblowers think is that the deck is stacked against them. What they don't know is the game is actually rigged. And that's part of what you learn going on this journey. But every whistleblower I know has an incredible story. Win, lose, or draw, what happened with them, why they did it, what happened with the family, what what the effects were, what the potential impact was to society. I'm friends, man, with some people with beautiful souls. They may not have money and wealth, but if they do it right, if they believe in it, they tend to live a life of purpose. And that's what we get with the film community, with independent filmmakers. Hey, if you guys need real stories that's got real drama and the overall story arcs, come to the Whistleblower Summit and you can meet more actual real life whistleblowers. And here's where we can start to have projects. And so now we've had a couple people that have projects that are in development, various stages, where we've made the matchmaking at the summit, and we want to do more of it.
Have you been able to measure the impact of documentary films on the whistleblower community? Is that a place where you guys are at yet, where you're able to say these films are starting to make a difference either in the number of cases that are being successfully won through the system, or even these films and this community driven by the films is creating a larger community? Is there any measurement you're using, any KPI? Not in that way. Not in that way. Kind of at least what I look at is understanding a lot of times when you blow the whistle, the biggest problem that a lot of whistleblowers have is once you blow the whistle, once the retaliation starts, you've got people that lose their careers, but
it's almost, there's a period where you're in whistleblower, you can be in whistleblower denial. Like, for instance, most people don't start off with the desire to blow the whistle, or they don't wake up one morning and decide that they're going to blow a whistle. Generally speaking, you can become a whistleblower by saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. And what happens is you become a threat to the system, and the system can start to retaliate against you. And ultimately, a lot of times it's that retaliation that makes you file, quote unquote, blow the whistle, because you're really doing it in self-defense. I tell a lot of people that when I talk to corporations, bad managers make good employees become whistleblowers. And the reason I say that is this: generally speaking, your whistleblower is not the guy who was on the bubble. He's not the troubled employee that everybody tries to tell you that, oh, they just blew the whistle because they were going to get fired anyway. No, usually the whistleblower is the good employee. He's a true believer, and he believes that he's helping the organization. He thinks that if he points out something wrong, that the organization will fix it, and he may actually be rewarded. So what happens is he has a moment of discovery that the organization wasn't what he thought it was. And depending upon how the managers manage that situation determines whether he'll become a whistleblower or not.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah. I look at the Facebook whistleblower scandal that's going on right now, and some of the big news that comes, or sort of a satellite around the primary story, is, well, this whistleblower might make $1 billion,
right? Because
the fine is going to be multiples of billions of dollars, right, so that it impacts Facebook.
Have you watched the CBS did a series on whistleblowers? I think it's called Whistleblowers. Well, listen, you're a journalist. One of the problems that we have, or I think that we have, is that because of journalism standards and ethics, they'll only go to print with stories where whistleblowers win their cases, and sometimes those cases, right, may resolve a recovery. Like, for one, the guy that blew the whistle on the Swiss bank, the Swiss bank accounts, Birkenfeld. Mm-hmm. Birkenfeld wound up making like $100 million from the recovery. The law firm, picks up $30 million. Mm-hmm. At the time that he blew the whistle, that law wasn't on the books. So he blew the whistle before there was any opportunity for a recovery like that. Winds up spending, was it 7 years in jail? Something like that. Wow. So what happens is, because the media, the corporations don't want to, for defamation reasons, they want to tell the stories of the whistleblowers whose cases were proven in court, which means they may have won money. It creates this false perception that people blow the whistle to make money. Exactly. And that whistleblowers blow the whistle and win their cases. When the other stats I just gave you is the truth, by and large, for the majority of whistleblowers.
Exactly. And it's so disappointing because the story becomes, right, oh, you tattletaled to, right, get rich. Right. And
as opposed to saving society.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I suppose I'd be not doing a very good job if I didn't ask you this question. What did Edward Snowden do wrong in his whistleblowing process?
Woo! Another great question. To me, Edward Snowden is a very, very interesting case where you literally, because some people say that Edward Snowden was a patriot. Some people say that Ed Snowden was a traitor. I personally happen to think that he's both. In one sense, we would not have, if I recall this right, we wouldn't have known about PRISM and the spying of government spying on all the telecommunications in America under the Patriot Act. We wouldn't have known about all those violations without Edward Snowden's disclosures. And so there was never a chance to even go to court for us to even litigate it, but for Edward Snowden. And so for that disclosure, I think that we owe him a debt of thanks and gratitude. I think his subsequent disclosures, and I think they dealt with some national security stuff. I need to go back over my notes. I think he may have crossed the line there. And then he absconds the country, and it becomes a resident arrest and all of that. So for me, I think that he started off doing well, doing a public service. I think he took it too far with some of those particular disclosures. That's just my take on it.
Yeah, and one of the things I love about your take and your experience in this is that you give people a guide. There's this 4-step guide, and I don't know if you've added a 5th or a 6th, but one is consult loved ones. So this is the guide that Michael has set forth for anyone who wants to blow the whistle, and that includes making whistleblowing films before you decide to do it. So step 1, consult your loved ones. Number 2, seek legal advice early. I think the word early is critical. 3, maintain a detailed record of everything that's going on. And number 4, consider working within internal channels. What does number 4 mean? Can you clarify number 4 a little bit for us?
Well, it's part of what you have to do. Sometimes it's the questions are going to become, did you call the tip line? Did you do everything that you were supposed to do? And that's part of the question you just asked about Snowden. Is what are the appropriate channels, and part of learning whatever the internal channels are, and then also with consulting the lawyer, they'll help you understand what other steps need to be taken. And so it goes to the point that you probably should try to exhaust the remedies or I guess it's don't go public first is your first step, because then you look like you're attention seeking. Then you may start this ball rolling downhill that becomes problematic. So these are things that most people don't really think about. And again, in all honesty, based on the conversation I just had, this is the ideal way to do it. But again, if you simply make a wrong statement at the wrong time, you can set in action, set in motion, essentially a chain reaction that may wind up forcing your hand anyway.
Yeah. When it comes to whistleblowing, it sounds like order of operations is critical. Mm-hmm. What are the 2 best pieces of advice you've received in your career, and who did they come from?
Career advice or advice related to whistleblowing?
I like to broaden it. I like for it to be as broad as possible. So if you've received advice in your life that's outside of whistleblowing that has stuck with you throughout your life, I would love to hear that and who it came from.
Well, let me stick with whistleblower first, because I'm in whistleblower mode right now.
Gotcha.
To me, one of the most important pieces of advice I've received, and I think that any whistleblower can receive, was given by Tom Devine. He's the legal director of the Government Accountability Project. Mm-hmm. And in one of our conferences, he said that the whistleblower's ability to survive his ordeal is based on the whistleblower's ability to maintain relationships, to establish and maintain relationships. Mm-hmm. And because isolation is the first thing that happens to you. They attempt to try to cut off your money. You become a pariah at work, possibly at home. Isolation is something that you have to fight against. And that, again, that's the reason that having a community, a support network is so important. But it's even more important with whistleblowers, because I'm not sure that the personality type that's willing to stand alone and blow the whistle. Marcel and I go back and forth about, is there a certain personality type that blows the whistle, or does the whistleblower ordeal develop certain personality types? But a lot of times you can run into people that will, they are so adamant to make a point that they start to lose their ability to effectively work with people. And it's one example. I'm not going to say the advocate's name, but he's such a pit bull against injustice. The problem becomes, you got a pit bull, but you don't necessarily know if he's going to bite you or the bad guy. And a lot of times we have problems where people really don't work together inside the camp. Yeah. So I think that's the single biggest piece of advice that I can give, and what it's really been the secret to our success, Marcel and I, is we came from ACORN. We're community organizers. Part of being a community organizer is you have to work with people. And essentially what we decided to do was use what we learned about organizing minority communities to organizing the most unusual community there is, the community of whistleblowers. And that's what the Whistleblower Summit and Film Festival represents.
That's wonderful. Do you have another piece of advice that you've been given that's stuck with you?
Boom, 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 boom. Not really. Not. I mean, that one was the biggest one.
Mm-hmm. Well,
and you kind of went through them with the tips, the documentation,
right.
And let me say this: the other piece of advice that I'll give, that I like to give, is one of the problems with being a whistleblower is that a lot of times it's a life-changing event that people don't necessarily recognize. It's like if you're a medical whistleblower and you blow the whistle on the hospital, you can lose your hospital privileges. Are you now still a doctor? Or if you're a lawyer and you blow the whistle and you become persona non grata with the judges, are you now really an attorney? And so a lot of times, especially when you're dealing with professional whistleblowers, their sense of identity can be shattered based upon the fact that they're no longer in the career that they spent 8 years developing and owe $200,000 for. So a lot of times, how do you find yourself? What is your self identity? How does it survive your whistleblowing? And a lot of times, what part of my advice is, again, the power of your story. You may no longer be a doctor. You may now be an author. You may no longer be an attorney. You may now be a filmmaker. I try to get people to see that sometimes the bigger asset is not whether you win or lose your case, but can you tell your story, or can you get your story told?
That's beautifully put. And we haven't touched on it a lot in this conversation. You've been so generous with your time, by the way. But you're not just saying these things could happen. I mean, this has happened to you. You've lost your real estate holdings, your funds, your job, your fiance.
No, I live this.
Yeah. And just imagine the conversation.
The hair club commercial. I'm not just a member. Or I'm not just a president. I'm a member. Yeah. This is for real.
That's right. Because one of the things that you don't consider, or you might not consider, if you're hearing this conversation, is just because you decided to blow the whistle doesn't mean your wife or fiance or girlfriend or boyfriend decided to. Right. They didn't sign up to be on this whistleblowing journey with you, and it really can cost you some of the most important relationships in your life. Maybe your brother, sister, siblings, friends. Right. It's a big decision to make, and we honor you for that.
Yeah, I would say, man, you never blow the whistle alone.
Yeah, you never do. That's absolutely the case. What are the top 3 whistleblower movies for myself and this audience to watch? So let's finish off the weekend, let's say, and we got 3 suggestions from you. What are we watching?
The Most Dangerous Man in America, Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. We actually featured that book. Of course, it's Daniel Ellsberg, the anniversary, but that was kind of the gala film for the summit this year. That's a very good film. I think you have to go with All the President's Men, even though there are certain aspects that I'd like to have a conversation with you about. But I think it really shows, again, you really didn't have the rise of kind of investigative journalism. It tells that story. Those 2 for sure. And then third, I tend to want to say maybe Civil Action. And it's because it kind of shows sometimes the absurdity of the legal process, or how things are adjudicated. And I think that's another aspect that essentially, I mean, honestly, to be a whistleblower, Chris, there's a certain level of faith that you have in the system. And while you may think that you might get screwed around with the agency or whatever or the corporation that you blow the whistle on. At some point in time, you have to have some faith that either the courts or through the appeal process, that there is some due process that you can get through the courts. And oftentimes it's just not the case. And so I think there has to be a film that talks about some of that, the realities of that process. And I think because the line that comes to mind when I said civil action was the film with John Travolta, and it was a toxic tort case. And the line that I'm thinking of, he says that the funny thing about litigation is you have two guys who are two parties that are fighting against each other, and the one who comes to their senses first loses. And that's what our courts are like.
That is a great line and just a wonderful place to conclude this conversation that I've just sincerely enjoyed. This has been fantastic, Michael. Can you tell everybody where they can find you on the internet, find the summit on the internet, find you on social media, and please do share the title of your book and where we can purchase that as well.
Okay. You can find the Whistleblower Summit is whistleblowersummit.com, whistleblowersummit.com. That's where you'll find the festival. My personal webpage is michaelmccray.net. That's MichaelMccray.net. The book, interestingly enough, Chris, I started writing about ACORN a while ago when it was going on. And I'm not sure how much creative writing that you do, but sometimes your projects kind of take on a life of their own. Mm-hmm. And so I started off wanting to talk about the fall of ACORN, but I realized that people really couldn't understand why we were doing it without kind of the backstory as to why do you get involved with ACORN and then what ACORN truly is. And so the book that I wound up writing 10 years ago is called ACORN 8, Race, Power, and Politics, Memoirs of an ACORN Whistleblower. And it essentially sets up why people join ACORN, what ACORN was supposed to do. And it takes you essentially up into the embezzlement that put everything else in the news. The next book that I'm writing that I'm hoping to complete sometime soon, the working title is Chief Organizer. Again, the ACORN 8 is the book series. And essentially, this is about our quest for truth, transparency, and accountability. It's the book that I was trying to write 10 years ago, but I feel compelled to write now because of kind of what's been going on with ACORN and the firestorm, and the left is trying to rebrand that whole episode. Race, Power, and Politics is available at Amazon, anywhere books are stores. You can order it from your local bookstore. You can also go to the ACORN 8 webpage, which is www.acorn8.com, acorn8.com. And the new book will also be there as well. Oh, and Chris, interestingly enough, the point that you were making about ACORN starting off as a good organization, something goes wrong, there's a quote that I'm using for the second book that essentially says that all movements start off, I think all causes start off as a movement, become a business, and then evolve into a racket. And wow. That's actually the theme of the book.
That is powerful. I love it. And let's end on this. Both of your parents were professional educators, college professors. Talk about your parents' impact on the development of your own moral and ethical backbone and your courage and persistence in taking on huge institutional organizations in the name of integrity and transparency.
Right. Easily from the introduction, the previous conversation, again, my mother was a professor. She became the dean of agriculture, School of Ag, and developed the Center of Excellence. And actually, there's one in fisheries. The other one, the first one that she created, though, was the USDA Center of Excellence in Regulatory Science. And so one of the things that involved me is that rules and regs have always been a part of my upbringing, as part of my dinner table conversation. It may be why I got into law and then also accounting. And it made me very much rules oriented. I understand the regs. I understand what's supposed to happen. And that's part of one of the things that deals with whistleblowers is they are, what I found by and large, people try to say that they're either disgruntled employees trying to avoid, working or whatnot, or that they are somebody who's seeking attention or perhaps a reward or bounty. What I've found is that generally they're people that have a strong sense of pride or character, and they refuse to be treated as a second-class citizen. It's just that when you go to a situation, when you understand the rules and you understand what's right and wrong, these are people that just stand up for themselves and refuse to acquiesce. And so that's one thing about learning the rules and understanding the rules. And again, my father's just a very, he was a math teacher, computer science major. And he's just religious and he's steadfast. And so I kind of got a sense of integrity from him. And then you kind of put that together with what I got from my mom, and you have Michael McCray.
Long live the Fifth Estate, because the Fifth Estate might be our last bastion of hope for freedom of speech and expression and liberty and individual sovereignty. I thank you for... Yep. I thank you for everything you've done. Would love to have a round two and would love to meet you in person for some blackened catfish and old fashioned and a viewing of All the President's Men.
Look forward to it, Chris. Hey, man, you're right over the river from me.
That's right. And until then, take care of yourself and keep fighting the good fight, brother. Appreciate you.
Likewise. Take care, man.
Take care. Bye.
You've been listening to the Make It podcast. To find out more information about this week's topics, including links to relevant blog posts, projects, and indie creatives, please visit our website at www.bonsai.film. If you haven't already, you can join our podcast community on Apple Podcasts or the podcast app of your choice by searching for Make It Bonsai Creative, and the show will pop right up. You now have the opportunity to support the production of this podcast. If you love Make It and are a true fan of what we're trying to accomplish in the indie film community, please visit www.bonsai.film and click Contribute. Contributions start at only $5 monthly. You can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at _Bonsai Creative and on Facebook by searching for Bonsai Creative. You can provide feedback to us via email at contact@bonsai.film. And you can follow me, Chris, on Twitter at Flaming Your Heart. That's FLAMEINURHEART. And of course, if you're looking to take a big step towards your filmmaking success, go to www.bonsai.film and click on Services to explore a variety of offerings from keynotes and panels to pitch readiness assessments and so much more. You have everything to gain. Until next time, be better, be creative, be engaged, and thank you for listening.
Tastemakers in the watch game like Gear Patrol have called their ceramic watch material almost magical and deemed their adventure-ready Cali Diver Automatic GMT the best sub-$500 dive watch, full stop. It's our friends at Movement. A Movement watch is built to run with precision, purpose, and X factors needed to make the best of the time you keep. From their best-selling automatics to innovative ceramics to more clean-inspired designs. Find your new Movement now at mvmt.com. That's mvmt.com.